Well, welcome to our crop day. This is an annual event we've had for many years, and we're pleased to have the program for you again this year. My name is Greg Andrus. I've been here a few years, and I'll be one of the speakers this morning. And also, I worked with a couple other persons to put the program together. So I'd like to introduce them. Joel Lemaire. Joel is a Foster County Extension agent located here in Carrington. And then also Tim Becker. Tim is the Eddy County agent located at Rockford. So I guess without any further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Joel Lemaire. Joel will be serving as the morning host.
We're going to start our program today with Mr. Bruce Dew. Bruce is a native of North Dakota and actually grew up fairly close here to the Eaton, Fessenden area. He's a graduate of North Dakota State University. Spent about 10 years as an agricultural education instructor, and the past 20 years has been working as with Michaelton Seed Company as a seed agronomist. He's presently living in Moorhead, Minnesota, and operates out of there. Bruce is going to share some information with us, taking a little bit of review of the corn crop of 2013, just like we had him last year, review the previous year's crop, give us some insight into 2014, and I guess he's also going to spend a little bit of time on a little bit of soybean production as well. So with that, we'll let Bruce start the program.
You know, last year was strange because if you look at the weather data, there's a lot of things that look very average. If you look at the total precip that we had, it's almost on average. If you look at the heat units we had, it's very close to average. In fact, what's a little surprising, we actually ended the year ahead of average because it sure didn't act the same when we got to the field with the combine. We didn't get to see the same numbers on the monitor. We sure did get to use more propane. And so sometimes it helps just to take and dissect things and take a look at how did we get to where we got. You know, just some observation for the 2013 crop year. If we take a look at generalities, I think when it came to soybeans, there were a lot of people that were positively surprised. I know in August, I was out looking at a lot of production fields, trying to estimate yields. We were pretty aggressive at getting more production fields lined up. And when the combines ran, there was a whole lot more beans there than the eye would tell you that there was. It seemed like in soybeans, we ended up with 5-10 bushel more than what most folks thought might be out there. That doesn't mean it was a bumper crop. It just means that there were more soybeans there than what the eye said there might have been. A lot of that was due to the fact that soybeans are a lot earlier maturing if you compare them to corn. The other thing that happened with soybeans is you don't hear too many people talk about stay green in soybeans. When soybeans reach maturity, they die. And when they die, they start losing moisture. Now in corn and sunflower, that's not the case. A lot of them continue to live, and so there was something that happened last fall that was very unusual that allowed soybeans to dry down and corn and sunflowers not. And of course, that was where we had our frost day. Corn yields were pretty much, I think, about what we expected. We had some areas of the state that didn't get rain. June, July, August were extremely dry. And in those areas, we were expecting 60, 70 bushel corn, and there was certainly some yield out there like that. I think for a lot of us that were in areas that got some rain, though, most found bushels about the way they thought they would be, or maybe slightly better. I know I wasn't expecting to see a lot of plots come in this year at 160, 170 bushel, and yet there were a fair number that did make that. Still struggled to get it off, but there were some pretty decent yields in some areas. And so if we take a look at the year, there were a lot of abnormal events that occurred during the year, and yet when you put them all together, they kind of average out, and you say, well, that kind of made sense, until you started looking at the moisture in corn and so forth. But here's the real thing. 2013 was far from normal, but what's even stranger is that 2012 was just completely abnormal. And what we do is we compare to last year. So 2012, we had very good yield. We had dry harvest time moisture. hardly used the propane tank. I mean, it was so dry that I even heard some guys saying corn got too dry. It started to break up when it went through the machine, so what a difference. Very, very good quality in 2012. We had a very early harvest. We had very good pricing. Fall tillage got completed. So part of our problem is that we were comparing things to 2012, and 2012 was so good, and actually 2013, the end result isn't that far from normal. Those of you that have grown corn for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, don't you usually burn some propane? Well, this year we burned a little more than normal, but 2012 was so abnormal. And so when we compare to 2012, it's just an unusual year to compare to, and we can't expect very many of these. Some of the issues that was there, we had an unusual spring, but we've had a bunch of those in the last 5 years. We started rather dry. We had a lot of areas that subsoil moisture was low. We did have a pretty strong snowpack. We didn't warm up in April. It caused for a late start for field work. And then what happened to us is that if you start looking at what happened in May for precip at the different areas around the state on NDON, you're going to find out that holy moly, some of us really got hammered with May rain. So when we take a look at some of those areas, this was Jamestown. This is the May rainfall at the Jamestown station. They got 9.5 inches. Normal is about 2.5. That was only about 7 inches more rain than normal. So it started to cause some real problems with spring planting. I took another peek at Harvey. Harvey got 6.4 inches, 2.3 is for normal, about 4 inches over. And so same thing, things got very, very wet. And when things get wet like that, there's some bad things that start to happen. Normal planting days start to back off. There's issues with seedbed preparation and planting, so we did a lot of mudding. There was some very, very poor growing conditions in those fields. Even when we did get the seed down, we had very shallow roots form. There was a lot of uneven stands, especially in some of the wettest parts of the field. And here's something that a lot of people, that goes over the top of your head. You put your fertilizer down, you say, I've got that taken care of. When it gets that wet, we lose it. And a lot of our issues last year surrounded nutrient levels more than perhaps a lot of other things. I'll show you some data later that we did on kernel size. Our kernel count, kernel size was way off last year. It takes a lot more kernels to make a bushel. A lot of that's related to missing nitrogen. A lot of that happened to denitrification. When you get wet, there's no air in the top of the soil. The microbes have to have air to survive. They start taking the oxygen off of the nitrate, and it turns into a gas, and so we lose the nitrogen. And it's not going to come back to you. That's lost to the air. During the summer, June, July, and August, and this is the Carrington station, this is what happened to precip. We got 2.8 inches. Normally we get about 9.5. Now couple that with very, very wet soil conditions early. It doesn't allow for deep roots. Now the top foot of the soil is really drying out, and that's where most of your root ball is at. Drought effects were quite a bit more evident last year, even though if you went down 30 inches, there was lots of moisture, but the roots weren't there. When you get that wet early, your root growth isn't normal, so we end up with most of the root ball in the top of the soil. So what happens is we suffered more than usual during that dry period because we had very shallow roots, and there were other places that nutrients were on the short side. Now when you get wet, your nutrient's going to go two places. You're either going to lose it to the air, or it's going to leach and go down into the subsoil. Either way, it wasn't reachable for the plants. I had folks that were doing soil testing in late June, middle of late June. We're finding out that 60% of the N they put down was no longer trackable. So they were putting on heavy applications for side dressing. And on those farms, we've seen relatively normal yield. 160, 170 bushel corn, but they put down quite a bit of N. They were putting down 40 pounds, 50 pounds at that time. And so they were resupplying some of the lost N, and the crop reacted to it. There was a cold spell the last half of July. Up until then, we were trending ahead for heat units. But if you remember, last 2 weeks of July, first week of August, we had a lot of nighttime temperatures that were dropping down into the low 50s, daytime staying in the 70s, and that's not corn weather. That's the time period we make corn. And so I have some weekly reports that I sent in that said, I don't like this. It looked like 2009 when we got to the first week of October. If you remember 2009, it was not pretty for corn. But what happened is August and September turned into pretty nice months from a heat unit standpoint. And so corn maturity didn't get to be an issue. Now this is the map showing GDU accumulation compared to 2012. Now remember 2012, good yield, dry corn, heavy test weight. And if you look at the GDUs that we have for 2013, they're very, very close to the same GDU. So this is one of the locations you look at average and you say, well, we should have had a crop more like 2012. If you look at GDUs for a 5-year average, we generally trended ahead of normal. We had more GDUs last year than we do normally get for the 5-year trend average. October, it's called the harvest month. And that's the month that we usually get most of our crop dried out. Large amount of rainfall. We had really wet field conditions, very poor conditions to allow for crop drying. Our warm temperatures literally disappeared. We'll take a look at the high temperatures for the month. They were way off normal. And then you couple that with a killing frost that came in probably more than a month late. And you start ending up with very wet crop conditions. November usually doesn't give us a lot of good drying conditions unless you happen to get a couple of nights to drop down to 0. And then it warms up and you can actually squeeze moisture out of corn when it's cold. And I think a lot of that's happened now. When we do get back to the corn, I think we are going to find out that it lost some moisture. We squeezed it out, but November is not known for drying corn. It's October. This is the precip, again using Carrington, that we had for October. So it was about 3 inches more than normal. Now there's locations around the state that were 5 inches, 6 inches more than normal. But when you look at a lot of locations, well, everywhere had more rain than normal. Now, if you're getting that much rain, there's not a lot of sunshine. Now, when you're getting rain in October, it's not warm rain, but you will have cooler temperatures associated with it. This is October maximum air temperature average for last year, and this is normal. Now, you may not think 6 degrees sounds like much, but 6 degrees is a huge departure from normal in October. And when you couple that with no sunshine and high humidity with all the rain, we just didn't get drying conditions to take place. Frost date, Carrington. You know, we had some nights that we got close, but this was the first date that you could conclusively say things are probably dead. And if you look at that, it's October 21st. What's your normal frost date? It's about the 20th of September. So there we sat for a full month with things living. Now, when you don't have a killing frost, these plants are continuing to take up moisture. Was there any moisture to take up? Let's see, it had 6 inches of rain. Yeah, there was lots of moisture to take up. Corn is mature, but the plant, the stalk, the shank, the husk, the cob, all continue to put moisture through it. And so we didn't have plants just drying down. Now the soybean dried down. Why? When soybeans mature, they die. They're no longer pumping moisture through them. So soybeans dried down and weren't too bad. You know, we fought it some, but nothing like we did the corn. Very late killing frost. It does allow for complete maturity, and last year we had some folks that needed that. In fact, if you go to the southwest corner of the state, there was some corn that didn't reach maturity. They got in very late. If you looked at the GDU maps, they were behind the 5-year average, and I seen some plot data coming out of there where the very early hybrids were 53 pounds, the 86, 87 day hybrids were 48 pounds, didn't reach maturity. But in most areas we made maturity. It allows plants to stay alive, so the moisture is flowing through them. And so it just delays the dry down process. And especially with plants that have very good late season plant health, sunflowers have that, a lot of corn hybrids have that. You breed it in so that they've got good stock. Well, when you don't freeze, it can not only give you good stock, it gives you green plants. So if we would have had a heavy frost the last part of September, we would have seen 3-4 points more moisture come out of our corn than we did. But with the water flowing through the plants, we just didn't get dry down, especially when the weather wasn't there to bring it on. Grain quality was considerably different for 2013. Anybody get to sell 62-pound corn this year? Remember 2012? There was 60-pound corn. And so if we reach full maturity, what happened with the grain quality? Well, one of the things that happened is when you combine corn this year, everything was wet. And you take test weights on wet samples. Wet corn is going to weigh less than dry corn. Now, supposedly, when you dry corn, you're going to pick that test weight up. It's a supposedly thing. Because if you were putting the corn through a high-temperature dryer, especially if it was 25 moisture corn and it was in there for some time to get down to the right moisture, you cook it. And we lose test weight because we're taking dry matter out of the corn. Kernel counts were also a lot higher in 2013 and 2012, and I'll show you some of that data in a bit. Typically, test weights on corn assumed at 15.5% moisture. A lot of our corn taken off at 20 to 25. Corn dry matter weighs more than water. If you got a bucket of water, a bucket of corn, the corn should weigh more than the water. So when you've got more water in the kernel, it reduces the test weight of the kernel until you take the moisture out. You should gain that test weight, but we cook it. If we take and look at what we usually pick up for test weight, 18% moisture corn brought down to 15.5, you'll pick up about 1.5 pounds. If you're taking 22 moisture corn down to 15.5, you'll pick up about 2.5 pounds. If you add that to the test weight that you were measuring from the field, then the test weights don't look near as bad. Still not as good as 2012, but certainly better than they were coming off the combine. But if you put it through high temperature drying, especially 175, 185 degrees and higher, and it was in there for some time, not only do you take the moisture out, but you take dry matter out. So there's a lot of times that you can put 23 moisture corn into a dryer and dry it at 180 degrees and take it out and not have gained any test weight. We lost bushel because we were drying wet corn at high temperature. The other thing that did happen to us is that we had a lot of stress environment, especially during that July and August time. We got dry. Now, when hybrids corn is going through a drought period, what will normally happen to the ear? On some hybrids, they'll tip back from the end, right? But even a hybrid that doesn't tip back from the end, what we don't see is the kernel size is decreasing. It's stress. So the kernels aren't filling completely, and so the kernels are smaller than they typically are. The other thing that we had going is in a lot of fields, we have nutrient deficiency, especially nitrogen. And when you've got that, you're also going to have decreased kernel size. Two different charts. Don't look at this chart and this chart. Just look at this one. These are kernel counts I did on hybrids in 2012. These are kernel counts on the same hybrid average for 2013. About 10,000 more kernels to make a bushel. In this case, it was about 12,000 more kernels to make a bushel. So your kernels coming off the ears just didn't make as many bushels because it took more kernels to make a bushel. It changes some every year. This is 11 and 12 average, so these hybrids I have data on for 11 and 12. This was last year's data. 2012 was a lower kernel count year than 2011. That's why the ranges are a little less here. But compared to the 2-year average, it took a lot more kernels to make a bushel in 2013 than it did 2012. So if you had the same number of ears out there, you didn't get as many bushels because the kernel count took more to make a bushel. Every hybrid is different. That's how come we're doing this. You can see that there's a big range between hybrids and what it takes to make a bushel. So we're doing the study to help better classify hybrids for planting population. But last year it was so very evident that our kernel count was way off. So what do we do for 2014? We don't know which of these we're going to have. 2012 we had a great year for nitrogen utilization. In 2011 and 2013 we did not. There are some of these things you can control, there's some that are hard to control. Pretty hard to control this one. Pretty dang hard to get around this one. But when it comes to nitrogen utilization, there's things we can do. We've got some people that are very good at working markets. I remember one girl I rode with, he told me he wasn't going to sell any corn this year less than $5.50. His hedging program was going to get him $5.50 a bushel for what he took off the combine. So there's ways to do that. Now granted, you got to do some things that most probably aren't schooled up on to do or just don't want to do. Who knows? What about this one? Will there be a farm program for 2014 or not? Probably. Will it look like one we had last year? Probably not. But here's the deal. There's one guarantee. 2014 is going to be different than last year. It's going to be different from the year before. Our problem is we're always chasing last year's target. And when we get there, somebody's moved the target. Now in 2012, we had a lot of folks up north that decided corn is easy. We put in 80 acres, we harvested dry, we put it right in the bin, we got $7, and the combine was put away by middle of October. Anybody can do this. So when they did the 800 acres of corn this year, they're saying, what the heck happened? Well, every year is different. And if we make all of our changes based on what happened last year, when we get to next year, this time, it'll be in the wrong spot. That's why you've got to use averages. You've got to think about what last year did. You've got to think about what the previous years did. And do you adjust the plan some? Of course. Do you make radical changes because of last year? Maybe. If I'm the guy in Botano County that tried 60 acres of corn in 2012 and 800 last year, I may make a radical change. And it probably makes sense. But for others, maybe not so much. And so a lot of what we do about planning for this next year is knowing what happened in 2014, saying, I understand that. Are we likely going to get in October with 7 inches more rain than normal in 2014? Likely not. Can we? I guess we can. But that isn't normal. And if we go back to normal, your 2014 cropping season is going to have to come to blows with averages for 2012 and 2014. You know, there's an old saying that says when the crowd is running, what do? We walk. Right now, the crowd is running to what? Soybeans. They're running away from corn. Now, simple laws of supply and demand and cropping dynamics are going to say there will be a lot of pressure put on soybean prices. And if we get a good soybean crop, we won't be looking at a price that we're looking at right now. And if that really does happen with corn, that we lose 7 or 9 million acres of corn, anybody looked at the drought monitor for the U.S. in the last week? Our backyard says we're fine. But there's a lot of the U.S. that the drought monitor is pretty nasty for. So next year's corn crop certainly isn't a guaranteed thing when you take a look at the amount of moisture that some areas need to receive. So the caution would be make changes that make sense, but don't make changes wholeheartedly that is based off of one weird October, given its conditions that we've got. Any questions? All right, thanks.